Hello and welcome back to the consistory of the coelc YouTube channel. I'm your host for this video, Reverend Zabel of St. John's Evangelical Lutheran Church located in Dalby, Queensland, Australia, a member congregation of the Confessional Orthodox Evangelical Lutheran Communion. And on this video, we're addressing the question as to should Christians practice the tradition of Santa Claus? And the answer is kind of yes and no, and we're going to explain this in more detail. So, the current practice of Santa Claus is that parents tell their children that on Christmas Eve, this magical man who lives at the North Pole, Santa Claus, is going to bring them presents, and the children get up in the morning and there's presents there, but we all know the presents were left behind by the parents. Now, there are some Christians that say we should have nothing to do with this, and while I would tend to agree more with that, there is a little bit more of a nuanced answer to this, and this actually goes back to the practice of Kris Kringle beginning with the reformer Martin Luther. So the tradition of Santa Claus actually begins with an older tradition in Western Christendom surrounding the feast day of St. Nicholas. St. Nicholas becoming Santa Claus as kind of a bastardization of the Dutch way of saying, as like Saint Lucas, it's become Santa Claus. As the time went by, the name kind of got changed from Saint Nicholas or Saint Nicholas to Santa Claus, and you get a similar thing with Kris Kringle as well, but we'll get to that in a moment. The older tradition was that there is a legend of Saint Nicholas throwing gold down a chimney and it landing in the shoes or the stockings of the people inside, and here St. Nicholas was trying to give money to a poor widower who didn't have enough money to marry his daughters off, because he had to pay like a bride price in order to marry his daughters off, but he didn't have the money, and so St. Nicholas threw the money down the chimney and it like landed in their shoes. And this started this tradition of, on St. Nicholas Day, or the night before, the children would leave their shoes out and the parents would put coins in the child's shoe, and then in the morning they'd say, look, St. Nicholas bought you money. Now, during the Reformation period, Luther wanted to try and move Christians away from this cult of saints, this saint worship that was going on in Roman Catholicism. And so Luther took this St. Nicholas tradition and he kind of Christianized it. He moved the gift giving from St. Nick's Day to Christmas. Instead of having St. Nicholas bring you the presents, Luther said that the Christkindl would bring you the presents. Christkindl being the German for Christ child. In the Dutch, it's kind of like Christkindl or Christkindl, which becomes Kris Kringle later, which is why one of the names for Santa Claus is Kris Kringle. It's kind of again, a bastardization of the name Christkinder, which is what Luther adopted. So this is actually then the tradition as to why we in Western countries today celebrate Santa Claus bringing presents on Christmas Eve. Because Luther established this practice. Or, to be more correct, Luther took an older practice that was connected with St. Nicholas and he tried to connect it with the birth of Jesus. So what Luther would say is, he would put his children to bed and say, oh, if you're good, baby Jesus will bring you presents. And then on the night of Christmas Eve, the Christkindl, the Christ child, the baby Jesus, would bring presents to the children. Now, in reality, it was Luther and Katie giving their children their presents, but Luther tried to take this older practice that was connected with the cult of saints and tried to connect it with the birth of Jesus. So now we ask, should Christians practice Santa Claus? Or can Christians practice Santa Claus? I think we can. Now, some will say, is this not lying to our children? And to some degree, yes, if you're taking on the tradition fully seriously and pretending that there is a magical man that lives up in the North Pole bringing gifts. But if you're having it as a more playful, imaginative game with your children, and if they really push you and you admit that, yes, it's just a game, then no, there's nothing really wrong with this tradition. Even just pretending with your kids that there's someone going to bring them presents is not necessarily lying in and of itself, because we can have games and we can have pretend and we can play around with our children. See, as it says in the Bible, when I was a child, I played like a child, I acted like a child, and then when I grew up, I gave up childish things. Yeah, if you're still believing in Santa Claus bringing presents when you're an adult, that's a problem. But if it's just a game with children, that's not as problematic. Now, you may have some more like personal practical reasons for why you may not want to do this practice, where it's like, you know, if I go pretending with my children that somebody's bringing on presents and they find out it's just me and I've been lying to them all this time, then they won't believe anything else I tell them and they might question their faith in God. But there are people that go, oh, when I was a kid, I believed in Santa and the Tooth Fairy, and then I realized when I grew up that God is no different. Okay, if that's actually going to be a problem, that Santa Claus could become a stumbling block to someone's faith, then yes, don't participate in that practice. But I don't think we can have a hard and fast rule, no, Christians should never have such a practice. However, I think we should very much follow the example of Martin Luther and try and move away from unchristian things and to Christianize this tradition. See, what Luther did is that the Catholics had a tradition of Saint Nicholas giving presents. And Luther says, how do I Christianize this? How do I move this away from this Roman papist cult of saints and make it more Christian? I know, instead of saying Saint Nicholas brings presents on Saint Nick's Day, I'll say baby Jesus brings presents at Christmas, which is, you know, the birthday of Jesus. And then I'll try and move it away from the saints and focus our attention on Jesus and the birth of Jesus by having baby Jesus bring the presents. And so if we were to follow Luther's example, we could still have a Santa Claus tradition, or better yet, a Kris Kringle or Christ child tradition, where we could say, hey, rather than having this, you know, magical pagan man that lives up at the North Pole with magical elves and magical reindeer bringing your children presents, why don't you follow the example of Luther and say, well, Jesus is bringing you the presents, or an angel brought you the presents, or something other than this magical, like, wizard that lives up at the North Pole. In the same way that Luther changed the tradition of the current culture at that time, which was a saint bringing children presents, to Jesus bringing the presents, we can follow the same example and say, rather than this magical wizard bringing presents, we could tell the kids that Jesus is bringing the presents. And yes, that is a lie, but if it's a pretend game and the kids kind of know it's just for a bit of fun, I don't see it being, you know, all that problematic. Now, again, there can be some practical reasons for this, and maybe it can become a stumbling block to a person's faith, and in that case, it's best to avoid it. But that is more of a case-by-case scenario, and you and your children can work that out amongst yourselves. So basically, I want to follow the example of Martin Luther. We're not going to set a hard and fast rule that says you can't have this tradition at all. I mean, Luther did similar things with his kids on other occasions. For example, there was one event where Luther was traveling away on a faraway country, and he wrote a letter to his son Hans. And he says, oh, I came across this park, and there was a man there, and in the park there was apple trees, and there were young boys playing with crossbows, and there was young boys riding on ponies, and oh, it was just the wonderful, you know, children playland. And I said, man, can my son come and play in this land? And the man told me, yes, but only if he does his homework and studies the Bible and is a good boy and does all his chores. And Luther made up this fictional playground and sent it to his son as a way of going, well, you know, if you behave yourself, you might get to go and play at this magical playground. And so Luther had this kind of playfulness storytelling with his children. Yes, it's a lying because the place didn't exist, but it's like an imaginative kind of just playing with your children. So we don't need to take it too seriously as a, oh no, thou shalt not, you know, bear false witness, so that would be lying and breaking the commandments. We can have pretend, especially with young children, having a bit of imagination. That's not a sin to play around and have these kind of, you know, bit of playful interactions with our children and just a bit of make-believe, pretend, imagination. That's not lying in the same way as, you know, the sin of lying. So we shouldn't have this hard and fast, no, you should never do this tradition, but doesn't mean you always should do the tradition. And there may be reasons to avoid such traditions. Maybe it might create problems in the future, and so it's best to avoid it in the first place. I think we should also follow the example of Luther, and we can change the traditions to make them more Christian, to focus our attention more on the actual birth of Jesus rather than on some kind of magical gift giver. So in the same way that Luther said, hey, let's stop focusing on the saints and let's focus on Jesus giving us gifts at Christmas, we could do the same thing now, where we say, hey, rather than following our secular culture who worship this kind of pagan wizard that delivers presents with a magical sleigh and flying reindeer, why don't we move the tradition away from that and start a tradition of saying, you know, maybe the baby Jesus or Jesus is bringing you presents, or maybe the angel Gabriel bring you presents. Yeah, it's make-believe, it's pretend, but still, if we're going to have this make-believe, pretend game with our children, why don't we do one that actually reflects the teachings of the Bible rather than some kind of cultural, magical, make-believe stories that is, you know, really just made up by, you know, companies to make more money. So I hope that really addresses the question as to whether Christians can or should participate in the tradition of Santa Claus. I've been your host, Reverend Jake Zabel. Goodbye and God bless.